Well, very interesting. Ezra Doramaja is a Turkish student at the London School of Economics, just returned from the country this week. Perhaps, Ezra, tell me how you felt being there while this was going on.
Well, it was definitely dangerous. This is something that nobody was expecting. Everybody was affected, so I think some of the calls that the protesters are miscreants or the deviants of society is completely not true.
And the perspective of how it's being reported around the world and how it's being reported in Turkey is completely different, is it not?
Right. So there was a major media absence at the very beginning, and this is the reason why a lot of people used social media. So it's important to put this all into perspective. In Turkey, Facebook is one of the #1 social media platforms. You've got about a third of the population on there, and the population of Turkey, the majority, is under the age of 30. And so a lot of the organization was there, a lot of the content that was being shared in the absence of Turkish media actually covering what was going on the ground. What you've seen happen since then is more and more testimony coming forth and also memes developing on social media, some of which I believe you've shown here as well. So that's been a response. But what's also important to remember is that just because people are on social media platforms, that doesn't legitimize them, or not necessarily the information is credible either.
How has that aspect of it, the social media, meant that the protests have evolved from what was initially a protest about the square and what was going on there?
Yes, it's been a rallying point.
Right.
So, like I said, the Turkish media has actually received a lot of criticism for not covering the protests or not covering them very, very fairly. And this is within a Turkish media landscape that has been seen to be under a lot of censorship or maybe even pressure from the government. So this is what people have been doing on social media, but we also have to be careful that there's a lot of groups that have nobody's claiming ownership of them. So what I've been trying to do is actually follow and document people who I actually know who are on the ground and share that information to the West. The West was very quick to come in, or let's say outside, and say, well, this is a Turkish Spring, or this is a riot, this is a revolution. But that's not really the case. And I think because there's so many people outside who don't have that local perspective, it can very easily be blown out of proportion.
And I think in hindsight, perhaps the Turkish government has talked about it, the American government has talked about it, that the way that it was handled by the police and seen by the rest of the world is maybe why it was likened to other uprising and revolutions. But actually now that has been drawn back. There seems to be more perspective on it, and what is happening in the main cities has changed as well, to these dance protests and celebrations.
Exactly, that's the carnivalesque type atmosphere that you see. So, as you rightly said, it used to be about trees in the park, and it's gotten into something much bigger now, where people are saying, we don't want police brutality, we should ban the use of tear gas, and they want recognition for who they are. That is in the space of a lack of credible opposition in Turkey that's actually standing up to some of the grievances that people would like to have addressed.
Very interesting to hear from you, Ezra. Thanks for coming in.
As we're hearing there, isn't talking between the two sides the only way to resolve it?
Well, you've got to identify who the people are actually going to be speaking to. So at the very beginning of everything that was going on, there was no organization, there were no groups that were very prominent in this. It's a very, very organic movement which has encompassed a broad range of people from different parts of society. That's why it's very hard to bring 17 people together who supposedly represent the entire dynamics of these tens of thousands of people who are coming out both in Ankara, Istanbul, and in other parts of Turkey.
Who have been invited to this meeting?
Who've been invited to this meeting? I don't think that's been publicly disclosed, actually. I haven't seen any names. I've seen, I think...
Well, you said 17 people.
17 people, but there's not very much detail on who these people are and what groups that they represent. And so even if you have this dichotomy of lack of representation, then how are you supposed to move forward when the people haven't been identified and objectives haven't really been clearly enunciated?
What do you think is the objective of the Prime Minister?
The objective of the Prime Minister as the head of the government in Turkey is obviously to ensure order in the streets. Now, how is he going to do that? Does it mean that dispersing the crowd is one way to do it? Does it mean using the police and use of force if necessary to do it? These are all options on the table if his objective is to have order on the streets of Istanbul, in Ankara and elsewhere.
I mean, how do you think this situation is going to develop?
I think the important thing to keep in mind is they will probably want this not to go on for much longer, because on July 8th, is the start of Ramadan, actually, which is the holiest month in Islam, where everybody will be fasting in Turkey. And I think the government will look to actually try to solve this situation in the next couple of weeks. Now, as for protesters' demands, if you're having a look at the protests, people on the streets, they want a few things. They want a ban to tear gas, they would like the use of police force to be addressed, and of course, the original issue, which is the removal of trees in Gezi Park, to be stopped.
And they'd like Erdogan to, if not to step down, to not to stand in front of the presidency.
Well, that's not really feasible because he's a popularly elected prime minister who's increased his share of the vote with each subsequent election. And you have to remember there's approximately 50% of the Turkish public who have voted for him. And so calls for him to step down I don't think are very effective, and neither are calls for the AKP government to come down either.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.